Imagine this. Every major power in Europe, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and the Pope himself, has just signed a single document. One document, one purpose: to destroy your country. Not weaken it, not conquer it, destroy it. Divide the land, erase the name, wipe it from the map. Now imagine you're the leader of that country. You cannot declare war on all of them at once. You cannot outfight them. Your army has just been crushed in the field. Your cities are surrendering one by one. Your allies have vanished. What do? Most rulers in history, faced with exactly this situation, either fled, surrendered, or were captured and killed. But there was one man in one city who did none of those things. He sat still. He thought carefully. And then, slowly, patiently, he dismantled the most powerful alliance in Europe without winning a single major battle. His name was Leonardo Loredan, and this is the story of how one calm man saved an entire civilization from disappearing. To understand how Venice survived, you first need to understand what Venice was. By the early 1500s, Venice was unlike any other place on Earth. It was not a kingdom. It had no king, no emperor, no dynasty of rulers passing power from father to son. Instead, it was a republic, one of the oldest and most sophisticated in history, governed by councils of powerful noble families who had been perfecting their system of government for over 7 centuries. And it worked. Venice controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean. Its merchant fleets reached Egypt, Constantinople, and beyond. Its ports processed more goods than almost any other city in Europe. Its treasury was legendary. But what made Venice truly unique wasn't just its wealth. It was its stability. While other Italian states collapsed into civil war, while foreign kingdoms tore themselves apart over succession, Venice endured. Its political system was deliberately designed to prevent any single man from seizing too much power. Councils checked councils. Laws constrained leaders. Even the Doge, the highest figure in the Republic, was bound by oath, watched by committees, and limited at every turn. It sounds like a weakness. In the crisis to come, it would prove to be a strength. In 1501, the man elected to lead this extraordinary city was Leonardo Loredan. He came from one of Venice's great noble families. He was experienced, respected, and, perhaps most importantly, he was calm. The kind of calm that doesn't come from ignorance of danger, the kind that comes from truly understanding it. He would need every bit of that composure, because the world was already turning against Venice. Here is something that modern observers sometimes miss about this period. The other powers of Europe were not simply jealous of Venice, they were afraid of it. Venice answered to no one. It negotiated with the Ottoman Empire when the Pope forbade it. It expanded its mainland territories, the terra firma, with a quiet, relentless efficiency that made neighboring states nervous. It played every side of every conflict with the cold precision of a merchant calculating margins. It was too independent, too rich, too clever. And in 1508, the frustration boiled over. Representatives of France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and the Papacy met in the French city of Cambrai and signed what became known as the League of Cambrai. The stated goal was almost breathtaking in its ambition: to strip Venice of all its mainland territories and divide the spoils among the alliance members. Think about what that coalition represented. France, the most powerful military force in Western Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, with claims stretching across Central Europe and Italy. Spain, already building a global empire in the New World. And the Pope, whose spiritual authority meant that Venice's defiance could be framed as heresy. Venice, for the first time in living memory, had no allies and no way out, or so it seemed. In May of 1509, the hammer fell. A Venetian army, substantial, professional, confident, marched to meet the French forces near a small town called Agnadello in the Po Valley of northern Italy. What happened next would become one of the most studied military disasters of the Renaissance. The Venetian command structure fractured under pressure. Parts of the army engaged, while others held back, waiting for orders that came too late or not at all. The French, commanded with precision, drove straight into the gap. By the end of the day, the Venetian army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Thousands were dead or captured. The survivors scattered. The commanders who lived were left trying to explain to the Senate in Venice how everything had gone so completely wrong. And then the collapse began. It happened with shocking speed. Cities that Venice had governed for decades, Verona, Vicenza, Padua, simply opened their gates to the invaders. There was no will to resist. No belief that resistance was even possible. In the space of weeks, Venice lost most of the territorial empire it had spent a century building, and outside the lagoon, the vultures were already dividing the carcass. Back in Venice itself, fear settled over the city like a fog. Senators who had never raised their voices in panic were raising them now. The question on every tongue was the same: is this the end? And that question brings us to the most important part of this story. When everything around him was collapsing, Leonardo Loredan did not collapse. This is harder than it sounds. In a moment of national catastrophe, the pressure on a leader to do something dramatic, to launch a desperate counterattack, to make grand promises, to perform strength even when no real strength exists, is almost irresistible. Loredan resisted it. He understood something that panicking leaders rarely do: that Venice's greatest asset in this crisis was not military. It was diplomatic. The League of Cambrai looked unified. But look more closely, and the cracks were already there. France wanted one thing. The Empire wanted another. Spain had its own ambitions. And the Pope, remember, the spiritual leader of Christendom, had joined an alliance whose goal was ultimately territorial conquest, not religious justice. That was a contradiction. And contradictions, in Loredan's world, were opportunities. Venice began to negotiate, not from strength, but with strategy. It made concessions where necessary. It acknowledged certain claims. It sent ambassadors with the patience to sit through months of difficult conversation, looking for the single thread that, when pulled, would begin to unravel the alliance. They found it in Rome. Pope Julius II, brilliant, ambitious, deeply political, had joined the League because he wanted to punish Venice for its arrogance toward the Church. Once he felt that Venice had been sufficiently humbled, his calculation changed. The Pope began to see France's growing power in Italy as a greater threat than Venice's independence. Quietly, carefully, Julius shifted. In 1510, he lifted the excommunication he had placed on Venice, and then, step by step, he moved toward a new alignment, one that would eventually pit former members of the League against each other. Venice had driven a wedge into the coalition. It was not the last one. Over the following years, Venice began the slow, grinding work of recovery. It retook Padua in a surprise assault, one of the few genuinely bold military moves of this period, and held it against a determined siege. That single act sent a message. Venice was not finished. It rebuilt its army. It brought in new commanders. It renegotiated alliances with shifting combinations of powers, always keeping its core interest, survival, as the fixed point around which everything else rotated. It never fully recovered what it had lost. Some territories were gone permanently. Some of the prestige of the pre-1509 era would never return. But Venice itself endured. The city endured. The Republic endured. The trade endured. The wealth, diminished but not destroyed, endured. And through all of it, Leonardo Loredan remained Doge. He ruled through the disaster, through the recovery, through the years of painful, undramatic negotiation and rebuilding. He died in 1521, having held the office for 20 years, a tenure defined not by conquest or triumph, but by something rarer: survival in conditions that should have been fatal. In 1509, Venice should have died. By every reasonable measure, military, diplomatic, territorial, it was finished. And yet, here is the thing about history that is easy to forget. Nothing is inevitable until it is over. The League of Cambrai looked permanent. It lasted less than 2 years as a coherent force. The total destruction of Venice looked certain. Venice survived for another 2.5 centuries. Leonardo Loredan looked like a ceremonial figurehead, bound and limited by a republic's rules. He turned out to be exactly the right man for the worst possible moment. Not because he was a military genius, Not because he was a charismatic orator who could inspire men to die for him, but because he understood what Venice actually was. Not just a city, not just a trading empire, a system. A system built over centuries, designed to endure and worth every sacrifice required to preserve it. He had not conquered Europe. He had done something far more difficult. He had convinced Europe, one court, one cardinal, one shifting alliance at a time, that destroying Venice was simply not worth the trouble. And in a world where entire states were being erased in a single campaign season, that was not a small thing. That was everything.